This is a public record podcast on CPAC, the Cable Public Affairs channel. On September 18th in Toronto, key stakeholders, military leaders, and academics gathered to explore the challenges and opportunities in the Arctic at the Mackenzie Institute's Canadian Arctic Conference. To start the afternoon session, former NORAD Director of Operations, Major General Scott Clancy, delivers a keynote address on Canada's NORAD commitment.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Thank you very much, Brian and the Mackenzie Institute, for inviting me here today to speak about a command that is near and dear to my heart. So I see my mission today as setting the stage for the two panels this afternoon. How does security and defense of North America and security in the Arctic, how does that interface? And I think one of the foundational elements to this is the North American Aerospace Defense Command. So my intent is to do this quickly. If I speak too fast, sorry. That's just kind of me. I want to inspire a debate around some of the fundamental issues about NORAD and defending North America. I will admit, and Brian knows this, I was reticent to come and speak with you today. My expertise is not on Arctic security. I've served in the Arctic. I've flown around Ellesmere Island extensively. I've served, obviously, in Alaska. I've been up in Alert a bunch. So I've been around Canada's north a bunch. But I'm an expert in the defense of North America, not in Arctic security. But I do think there's a link between the two. But Brian and I agree that a discussion about Arctic security requires the framework of a larger discussion pertaining to continental defense. And these are my thoughts alone. Okay, I don't represent anyone, but some of these I've shared hotly with General Van Herk and Lieutenant General Pelche, my old bosses. So, this should be a lot of fun. Okay, next slide, please. So why NORAD? NORAD's history does not begin with the declaration and stand-up of the NORAD command. The history of NORAD stems from the Cold War era after World War II and the emergence of the Soviet Union as the primary adversary in a bipolar world. But more than that, the nucleus to NORAD is rooted in the fundamentals of two allies that share two things that form the roots of our alliance: shared geography and shared values. Next slide, please. This manifests itself in the essence of all Canadian defense policy, and those of you that are academic experts on following defense policy will recognize this. All Canadian defense policy has always contained two imperatives and one choice. You must defend Canada, you must defend North America, and everything else is a choice. And we see it manifests in, contribute to international peace and security, support a rules-based order, or right now, engage in the world, right? Strong, secure, engage. Strong is about Canada, secure in North America, and engage in the world. I'm not belittling that other place, but that is the away game, and we're going to get to that in a sec. Next slide, please. So NORAD's inception in 1958 came at a time when there were very large air forces on both sides of the border, Canada and the United States, much of it oriented on the possibilities of large bomber forces coming from the Soviet Union across the poles to drop gravity bombs on our cities, nuclear bombs. Next slide, please. As the threat moved into the 1960s and 70s, it evolved from a bomber threat to being more of a multifaceted threat with the advent of ballistic missiles and the delivery systems of primary backstop to deterrence in mutual assured destruction. Right? You launch your missiles, I'll launch mine, they'll cross in the air, we're all dead. Because I don't think you want to end the entire world, you'll never launch and I'll never launch, and we carry on. Next slide, please. So by the 1980s, the NORAD infrastructure needed to be fundamentally modernized, and the famous distant early warning systems, the DEW line and the Pine Tree lines, were replaced with what we know now as the North Warning System. Next slide, please. This was largely due in part to the project to project more warning, for the incursion of bombers from the USSR coming to launch cruise missiles now, not drop gravity-fed bombs. Now, at the time, these had limited ranges, so those aircraft had to come further south, hence why the radars were important. That has changed over time. Those cruise missiles would thereafter fly under our defenses, and were almost impossible to shoot down and had replaced the gravity bombs of the previous era. Next slide, please. So the small time between the end of the Cold War and 9/11 saw NORAD maintaining its focus on what had not disappeared: the need to warn and characterize threats on the continent to both governments. But 9/11 was a watershed moment, obviously for everyone. I was in the Canadian NORAD region on the morning of 9/11. What 9/11 did is it reinforced the need for commands such as NORAD. And I postulate it also showed how the Russians were for exactly who they were. Because on the morning of 9/11, we went to DEFCON 3, and I watched Rick Finley, I watched very closely Rick Finley order the NORAD Enterprise and the Enterprise of the United States to DEFCON 3. But it's predicated on the fact that the Russian forces were forward in their forward operating bases, we were forward in ours, and every NORAD exercise in the previous 50 years had started with a terrorist attack on the continental United States. And it took the Russians 2 weeks to come out of those forward operating bases and back down. So we actually thought that this was the precursor to war, hence DEFCON 3. Next slide, please. So Canada and the US and our other allies, since 9/11, have been prosecuting the away game. And the away game, or the global war on terror, is about fighting our nation's wars overseas, on someone else's. It's ingrained in us from the world wars. If we advance to those threats being somewhere else, they will not manifest at home. Now, Operation Noble Eagle, the operation to counter those threats and those, especially terrorist threats at home for NORAD, harmonized both our internal and external warning systems and further expanded the ability of the command, NORAD, to warn and characterize threats through the stand-up of United States NORTHCOM as one of the global combatant commands of the U.S. Department of Defense. Next slide, please. Actually, yeah, you should be on threats. But as Western nations focused on this away game, Russia and China never stopped thinking and acting in terms of global competition, and especially at the great power level. As the Middle East missions evolved, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, whatever it was, Russia began flexing its muscles at each and every incursion into the air defense identification zones of Canada and the United States. They approached our coastlines from all sides, they still do, and the most recent incursions, as you heard from Brian, include Chinese aircraft along with them, and I have long said, where you see the intersection of Russian and Chinese interests, especially in military cooperation, you worry. Although NORAD is focused on airborne threats, the delivery platforms for those threats span across all of the domains. We were talking about cyber here a little bit earlier. Obviously, that's one of them. And the advent of the NORAD warning mission highlights the requirement to track sea-based systems that in an instant, and possibly within close proximity, will threaten North America. Now, the proximity of Russia to Alaska, to be clear, from the forward operating base that they have at Anadir, it's a 30 to 45-minute flight to the edge of American airspace in the Bering Strait. It takes 2 hours to fly a Raptor at full speed to that same spot. That's a problem. They can be there in 30, 2 hours, you do the math, right? So the geometry just doesn't really work. So this brings threats from things like ground-based launch or ground-launched cruise missiles into the sphere of those threats as well. So the routine operations of Russian surface and subsurface vessels along the coastlines down to Cuba on both coasts becomes a problem as well, because they are carrying weapons designed to attack North America, and this is becoming an annual thing, sometimes more than annual. This evolution on both coasts and in the Arctic typifies a pattern of covert aggression, commonly referred to as competition. We're in great power competition, right? On the spectrum of conflict, competition, crisis, conflict. But when you layer that over the pervasive informational and cyber activities bent on undermining the foundations of our democratic and capitalistic societies, along with overt war in Europe, it seems to me to be the indications of crisis and the pending indications of conflict. Next slide, please. So, that's the beginning of why for NORAD. If you didn't have a why there before, I think you saw that. But I think we have to continue with that why as I explain a little bit of the what. So let's get into the what of what NORAD is. There are 3 core elements to the NORAD agreement, and they're copied into the NORAD mission you see in the top line of the slide. And the Maritime Warning Mission was added in 2006. But it's the theory of success surrounding the NORAD strategy that speaks more to how intellectually NORAD is going to partner with U.S. NORTHCOM into this fight. Funny enough, this strategy was penned by General Van Erck, which you're going to hear from later on tonight. The pervasive attitude, if not all of our Occidental partners, is to fight our nation's wars overseas in the away game, as I've already mentioned. Take the fight to the enemy. Fight them in the away game so those threats don't manifest at home. 9/11 and subsequent operations against al-Qaeda and the global terror supporters reinforced the success of this as we took the enemy there and those terrorist threats ceased to manifest on North American continent. And the backstop remains a strong nuclear deterrent. Okay, that works up to a point because you have to convince the adversary that an attack on North America will not yield results. Now, for decades, detect, deter, defeat were the three words that NORAD used to describe its operations. It was on all of our badges, on our shirts. We put it on baseball hats. We had it all over the place. But you can see two other D words that have directly changed how NORAD proposes to fight. De-escalate in crisis, I believe, is a recognition of the less than binary nature to the concept of deterrence in our modern age. The realization that even and especially in a crisis, leaders must attempt to de-escalate the situation as a means to survival. I believe that this is a more elegant approach to a crisis, and I've always liked it. It speaks to me that deterrence actually never ends. That Russians are at our borders means I still have to carry on with that deterrence. They might have even launched the first attack. I still need to deter the follow-on attacks. It's a more elegant solution, but it's definitely more complex. But it is the advent of the concept of deny, the other D word, that fascinates me and has since my introduction into the NORAD command realm. Defeating an overwhelming cruise missile strike, conventional cruise missile strike especially, was going to be key in deterring the attack in the first place. I have to be able to punch you in the face to actually deter that you're going to beat the crap out of me, right? Stands to reason. But it was proving to be almost impossible with the forces that were available to the Commander NORAD and the concept of operations, shooting down cruise missiles with airplanes. So ensuring that we can deny the adversary their objectives, prove to them that they will never achieve the results that they want. This is the key deterrent theory that drives the NORAD strategy. The how thereafter expands into the concepts of domain awareness, information dominance, and decision superiority, all rooted in a framework of global integration and domestic resilience. Next slide, please. A little bit more of the what, okay, and the how. To execute the mission, NORAD's divided into three regions in the NORAD agreement: the Alaskan NORAD region, the continental NORAD region, and the venerable Canadian NORAD region. These regions are ringed by the Canadian and American air defense identification zones. So think of these as internationally known barriers that all air traffic that enters into them must be identified to the national authorities of either country, usually through the Federal Aviation Authority in the United States and NAV Canada in Canada. Any unknown contacts, those not on flight plans or known to NORAD, may be dealt with by NORAD. May. It's a choice. That choice is made by the commander of NORAD. Next slide, please. A little bit more of the how. NORAD's a binational command. The command reports to both national authorities, the CDS, the Chief of Defense Staff in Canada, and the Secretary of Defense in the United States. It's important to note the relationship difference between the United States and Canada here. In Canada, all military power flows through the Chief of Defense Staff. There's not somebody else talking to the minister. The minister can't order forces through. All military power flows through the Chief of Defense Staff. Currently, Jenny Carignan, good friend of mine, by the way. I like Jenny. We've served together very often. Please note the presence of a deputy at all levels of command inside the NORAD enterprise that is from the other nation. As the deputy of the Alaskan NORAD region, I wielded all of the authorities that the commander of NORAD had vested in my boss. And I did this all the time. In fact, due to his other hats, so the commander of my boss in Alaska was also, although he's the commander of the Alaska NORAD regions, he's also the commander of Alaskan Command for US Northcom, but he's also the commander of 11th Air Force for the United States Air Force, reporting to the commander of Pacific Air Forces. And he had forces all the way from Alaska, Hawaii, out to Diego Garcia. He was gone a lot, and whenever he was gone, visiting his troops, doing those command things, I was holding the bag. Now, more often than not, even when he was in the state, he was out talking to his forces, which he would be out of communications range. That meant that I was holding the bag again. Now, this might not faze any of you, but if you're in a military command somewhere else, you're going, yeah, no, we don't pass command across national lines. That's just not done. But in NORAD, not only is it done, it's just a matter of routine. You don't even bat an eye at it. And there's no greater testament to the binational nature of command and of our mutual commitment to each other's nations and people than 9/11. So on the morning of 9/11, as Brian had articulated, Canadian General Rick Finlay, in my old position as the Director of Operations for NORAD, was holding the bag for NORAD headquarters. In the continental NORAD region, which is down in the States, bulk of the NORAD piece in the continental United States, General Charlie Bouchard was the commander in charge at the time, a Canadian. And in the HQ that I was in the Canadian NORAD region, Brigadier General DeQueer, United States Air Force, was in command of the Canadian NORAD region. So, on the morning of 9/11, all the deputies were in charge. And nobody batted an eye. Everybody responded as if it was as important as that day has turned out to be. That is the testament to the binational nature of that command. Next slide, please. Now, the establishment of United States NORTHCOM in 2002 is a direct result of 9/11. And it's one of the U.S. global combatant commands. It's enabled NORAD by tying the mission to the global command systems that the U.S. Department of Defense uses to characterize and deal with threats worldwide. It means that NORAD's not just looking at that thin veneer of air things, it's actually looking at everything because that commander, so General Van Erck was the commander of NORAD and U.S. NORTHCOM. He's dual-hatted in that. At the table, he's now looking at that global defense across all of the combatant commands of the United States Department of Defense, and he's bringing along his Canadian partners with him in seeing that battle space. What that does is it means that our ability as staff to integrate into the processes that globally defend our continent is enhanced. Globally deter and characterize threats now becomes bigger. We're looking at all of the domains, not just the air domain. Now, to be clear, when you look at those combatant command systems, the commander of United States European Command that you see on that slide, he's double-hatted. His other hat, he's Supreme Allied Commander Europe for NATO. The commander of United States Strategic Command is conducting global strike missions all over the world, is now being influenced at that global table by a commander who's in a binational command with Canada. It impacts the way in which we have the ability to influence the deterrence of our adversaries. In a good old hockey analogy, however, the commander of NORAD, U.S. NORTHCOM, needed to get into the corners and start swinging elbows, because the big boys at that table, U.S. INDOPACOM, U.S. STRATCOM, EUCOM, they're not having any of this homeland defense thing. So this becomes the tough fight that I watched subsequent commanders of NORAD and U.S. NORTHCOM have to deal with. Next slide, please. So, now I'm going to present my book. No, not the one I wrote, the one that's fictitious in my mind. It's called The World According to Scott. It's my favorite book. I quote from it all the time. This is unclassified, please, and I'm going to keep the generic responses for NORAD to how I see this fight evolving, to a very generic level. But what I want to do is kind of describe how I think this fight's going to go down. I'm going to step away from the microphone for a sec, because I need to watch. Next slide, please. So the first thing that I think that's going to happen in a fight is that you're going to see submarine forces from the Russia, that will go first, approach the coastlines of the United States, if on 2, if not on 3 coastlines. Once those submarine forces cross specific gaps, they become very difficult to detect, especially through the GIUK gap. This provides a real problem to everybody dealing with defense of the continent. Ground-launched cruise missiles will be placed in and around close to the Anavir region, up in, across in Russia's side of the, across the Bering Strait in Alaska. Next slide, please. Next thing that's going to happen is you're going to see major cyber attacks, hopefully cascading across Canada and the United States, meant to isolate Alaska, isolate the command and control systems of the commander who's attempting to defend the continent, and degrade all of the resilience capabilities of the domestic partners, DHS and public security, that are meant to be able to do this. Okay, what's going on? Turn it on. I will. We're going to wait 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. I don't wait well. Okay, so the next thing that's going to happen, next slide, please. Those ground-launched cruise missiles are going to take out specific targets. They're going to take out targets especially designed to limit the ability of the commander NORAD to respond to bomber forces that need to approach the coastlines, especially in the north, from Alaska to be able to range the lower continental United States, along with those electromagnetic attacks that will limit the command and control abilities to respond to threats on all sides. They'll also use cruise missiles launched off of their submarine forces to do so. Note, this is an all-domain fight all at the same time. What NORAD's going to be doing to defend this is deploy into forward operating bases, use its radar systems and its long-range early warning systems on the coastlines, as well as in the north, to try to identify the archers. Those are these bomber forces before they can approach the coastline. They're going to be using sea forces. They'll be allocated to the commander of U.S. Northcom and the Canadian Navy in conjunction to try and seek out these subsurface forces and kill them before they can launch. Now that's interesting, because who takes the first shot, right? I'm presenting this as a sequence of events, but you got to realize these could happen in some different order. Next slide, please. The next way this fight's going to come up, next slide please, you're going to see bomber forces come across into Alaska. They're going to range the southern United States and take out all of the targets that they want in a conventional fight. This is not a nuclear, hey, because we just think about it in terms of some film. You have 400 bombs that go off across the United States. I don't think the US Stratcom is going to launch a world-ending volley at Russia. So that's going to be an interesting thing to be able to deal with. Next slide, please. That's going to be followed on with further bomber forces, further cruise missile attacks that are going to range the United States. What's NORAD going to do about that? It's going to continue to characterize the threat, but it's going to also continue to make sure that the rest of the enterprise that could respond is able to, whether it's the United States Department of Defense or Canada's ability to respond or even characterize that threat to NATO. Next slide, please. At any time, Russia could launch portions of or a volley of intercontinental ballistic missiles, which NORAD would again characterize to both nations as to what that means. Those, for the most part, would be nuclear-based. That's the end state game. But that doesn't have to happen. Now you can see, the reason why I provide that fight to you is it gives you a sense to how this goes, because I think that's about the what of NORAD. Next slide, please. Okay. I would like now to present and end with 3 paradigms from which I look at the why and what of NORAD. And they're meant to inspire the debate, and I know that at least 2 folks in the room, my former bosses, might have opinions on them. As a side note, I've always honored the levels, especially that these 2 gentlemen, awesome leaders, have allowed me to think and explore. And it's a testament to, I think, a lot of our organizations when you're given the latitude to be able to voice your opinions and debate these kind of things hotly. And in the command that I was part of, where we're defending the continent, I think it's important to hear all of the avenues, have a commander make a clear decision, explain it, and then be able to carry on. And that's what I had from these 2 men. So they heard me out, they debated it, and we made decisions that I clearly understood, and then I explained it to the enterprise, and we executed. So, next slide, please. This is Scott's report card, not on me, but on NORAD. I do not believe that NORAD could defeat enough of the threat. What does enough mean? Well, whether it's in terms of denying the adversary the objectives they want to achieve or overarching deterrence, I think the concept of operations of NORAD that NORAD is forced into and that the U.S. DoD is focused on fighting the away game hamstring the commander of NORAD, U.S. Northcom, and belie the vulnerability of our homeland. NORAD is slightly better at detecting threats, but only slightly better. But that characterization to the 2 nations, speaking to the strategy that General Van Erck penned, needs to be as far left of launch as possible in order to provide decision space for national leaders to be able to confront and use all of the measures of national power to be able to counter that threat. So and we tried to do this significantly, under General Van Erck's command. Signal to the right, we see you moving, we see you doing these things, so that we can give that signal of deterrence so that they can think twice before they make their actions. So, deter. Well, we're here right now, right? So deterrence worked. But the binary look at deterrence is not helpful, I don't think. Deterrence fails absolutely once an attack occurs, but one will never know when deterrence actually failed in the mind of the aggressor, as that could have already been years in the past. Next slide. So my second piece of the second paradigm I want you to look at is, what does Canada get from the alliance in NORAD? Let's not forget that standing tall with our American allies against oppression, tyrants, and dictators is the right thing to do, period. So beyond the obvious benefits of deterrence, Canada gains the trust of our strongest ally and partner. Trust underpins every relationship. As a matter of fact, my personal definition of leadership, read my book on leadership, my personal definition, that was a shameless plug. The personal definition of leadership is that it is an emotional trust relationship. And participation in NORAD entrenches that trust as a national as well as at a personal level. I trust the man who sits there because I trust everything about his leadership. It's at a personal level. And at a national level, I trust the NORAD enterprise. Now, I've also watched Canada directly influence the conduct of global deterrence throughout our access and influence for U.S. NORTHCOM and NORAD, especially the influence they have at that global Department of Defense table. Now, that access directly benefits Canada as we try to globally integrate our operations even beyond NORAD. What we're doing in Latvia, what we're doing everywhere else has an impact, even what we do in our own Arctic that has nothing to do with NORAD. As with anything, and as with this conference, participation in NORAD gains Canadians' perspective, from the geostrategic right down to the personal level. I understand our U.S. allies, having served alongside, followed, and commanded within their architecture. And I have a unique perspective on the world because of my time in Alaska, my almost constant interactions with the Alaskan First Nations and that enterprise and corporation, but also the proximity to not only Russia, but China, U.S. Indo-PACOM, and U.S. Indo-PACOM's preoccupation with China. Well-founded, by the way. Next slide, please. So this leads me to conclude with 3 questions that I will leave you with. How do we see modern deterrence as it nuances away from a punishment-based framework, mutually assured destruction, right, to one more based on denying adversary objectives? Second, what is NORAD supposed to defend? I think a lot of part of this conference was about the Arctic. Okay, but I could postulate that I could defend North America without defending the Arctic. Right? It really depends on the weapons platforms and how that goes about. But there's a discussion to be had there about what is it that we are defending. Governments, people and populations, key infrastructure, military mobilization centers, defensive command and control, Arctic indigenous populations, or the Arctic. What is it that we're actually defending? Because if you're defending everything, you're defending nothing. Third question, my final point. What is the relationship between defending the continent and security in the Arctic? Now, could I ask the NORAD Director of Operations to drag the blue circle over the entire Arctic and guarantee all aspects of Arctic security? No. It doesn't have the manpower to do it. It doesn't have the presence. As a matter of fact, there's national sovereignty issues there. We've seen economic, health, infrastructure things. NORAD's not in the place to be able to do that. Could I defend North America and North American without basing in worrying about the Arctic? Well, no, not right now, but maybe. Well, then that might be a problem because then they're mutually exclusive. Now, these 2 truths can coexist, and I think that as we define how we see the Arctic and how we see global security as we move forward, having the discussion about how those 2 concepts intertwine, how they relate, that's going to be the fundamental question about how we defend the continent and its link to Arctic security. Thank you very much.